Welcome. You've reached this peaceful moment as your day comes to a close. As you get comfortable, allow your mind to quiet down. Let the day's busy sounds gradually fade away. This evening, we'll discover how the Norse people of Scandinavia made it through their winters. For almost half of each year, their world was freezing, dark, and blanketed in snow. Temperatures fell well below the freezing point. Daylight stretched for just a few hours each day. In these conditions, keeping warm during the night was crucial for staying alive. How did families handle this? How did they sleep without freezing to death? Their approaches were straightforward, perfected over many generations. They depended on well-built shelters, thoughtful use of materials, and regular routines. There wasn't one simple solution or secret. It was many different things working in harmony. In the time ahead, we'll journey through one winter night in a Viking home. We'll observe how they got ready as darkness arrived, how they kept warm through the night, and how they rose again in the morning. So get comfortable and let the story develop naturally. Winter days in Scandinavia were brief. By the middle of the afternoon, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. By 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it had disappeared. The sun's journey across the sky in winter was low and short. It appeared late, around 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. It never rose very high. Even at its highest point, the sun stayed low, creating long shadows on the snow. The temperature fell as soon as the sun vanished. What was already cold became even colder. Frost built up on surfaces. The air turned crisp and motionless. This was the sign that outdoor work should stop. Animals needed to be checked and moved toward shelter. Fuel needed to be brought near the home. Water needed to be gathered before it turned to ice. The change from day to night occurred rapidly. Within an hour, complete darkness had arrived. Working outside after dark was hard and risky. Most jobs had to be finished while some daylight remained. People went inside. They brought the children indoors. They shut doors and got ready for the long night ahead. Outside, the world would be dark and frozen for the next 14 or 15 hours. The evening routine started not when the sun set, but when it began to weaken. By the time true darkness came, the household would already be closed up inside. The fire built higher, the evening meal in progress. The longhouse door was small and set low in the wall. This design helped prevent heat from escaping. When someone came in or went out, less warm air got out. The door opening was about 3 feet wide and maybe 4.5 feet tall. An adult had to bend down to get through. The small size reduced air exchange every time it opened. The door itself was made of thick wood that provided insulation even when shut. Walking inside meant an instant temperature change. Outside might be 0 degrees or colder. Inside was maybe 15 or 20 degrees warmer. The difference was obvious immediately. The inside was lit only by the central fire. The light was faint and flickering. Smoke gathered near the ceiling, but the air closer to the floor was cleaner. The space smelled of wood smoke, dirt, and people. There was also the smell of animals from the far end of the building. These smells were always present in the indoor space. The floor was packed dirt covered with straw. Along both long walls, raised wooden platforms worked as benches during the day and beds at night. These platforms were about 2 feet high, keeping sleepers above the coldest air. The walls were thick. From inside, it was difficult to see their full thickness, but they stretched several feet. These were built from stacked turf blocks, dirt with grass roots holding it together. This was home. This was the safe place that would protect the family through the long, cold night. The longhouse was one big room that served many purposes. The main feature was the hearth, a long fire pit lined with stones. It stretched down the middle of the floor for 15 feet or more. This central hearth was called a lengal. It wasn't a fireplace built into a wall, but an open pit placed along the center line of the building. The location was intentional. Heat spread outward in every direction, reaching both side walls equally. During the day, people worked on the floor near the fire. They sat on the raised platforms along the walls. The platforms were wide enough for several people to sit comfortably. People faced inward toward the fire, working on different tasks, spinning wool, fixing leather, sharpening tools. At one end of the building, a wooden wall separated the human living area from the animal area. This barrier was about waist high. Behind it, the family's cows, sheep, and goats spent the winter. The low wall allowed warm air from the animals to flow into the main hall while keeping the livestock contained. Storage areas were found beneath the sleeping platforms. Clay pots, leather bags, and wooden boxes held food, tools, and other needed items. Everything was kept off the ground to protect it from the cold and moisture. The walls had no windows. Small openings near the roof let smoke escape, but no natural light came in. The fire provided all the light. The ceiling couldn't be seen. Smoke filled the upper part of the space. The roof beams were up there somewhere, darkened by years of smoke. As evening started, the activity in the hall changed. People moved from daytime work to evening preparations. Work materials were put away. Tools were returned to storage. The floor area around the hearth was cleared. People changed their positions on the platforms, settling into more comfortable postures. Children were brought closer to the fire and to adult supervision. Movement slowed. Voices grew quieter. The focus moved toward the fire itself and toward the evening meal. The household was coming together. The scattered activity of the day was giving way to the gathered routine of the evening. Everyone was moving closer to the center, closer to the warmth, getting ready for the long night ahead. One family member took charge of the fire tonight. This job rotated, but everyone knew how to handle it. The fire had been kept at a moderate level during the day. Now it needed to be built up to provide more heat and light for the evening. The process began with checking the existing fire. The firekeeper looked at the embers, judging their heat and how they were spread out. The coals glowed red in some spots, gray ash covering others. Understanding the fire's current condition determined what to do next. The main fuel was peat. This had been cut from bogs during summer and dried. Peat burns slowly and gives off steady heat. It makes less smoke than wood when properly dried. Peat was cut in rectangular blocks during summer months. The cutting was done in established bog areas where peat had formed over hundreds of years. Each block was about the size of a brick. After cutting, the blocks were stacked in open arrangements to allow air to move around them. They dried for weeks in the sun and wind. Properly dried peat was dark brown, almost black. It felt light for its size. When broken, it showed a fibrous texture, compressed plant material that had partially broken down over hundreds of years in the waterlogged bog environment. Wet or poorly dried peat would not burn well. It would smolder and make too much smoke. The burning qualities of peat made it perfect for the Viking longhouse. It caught fire at fairly low temperatures if dry. Once burning, it gave off strong heat with little flame. The burning was steady and predictable. A piece of peat the size of a fist could burn for an hour or more, giving off heat continuously. The smoke from peat was different from wood smoke. It had a distinctive earthy smell. The smoke was also less visible than wood smoke when the peat burned well. This meant less smoke building up in the living space, though some was always there. Small pieces went on first, placed carefully to allow air to move around them. The embers heated the new fuel. Small flames appeared and grew. The firekeeper chose pieces about the size of a clenched fist. These were placed directly on the glowing embers, not in a pile, but arranged with spaces between them. Air needed to flow through and around the fuel. Without air, the fire would be smothered. The placement mattered. Pieces placed too close together blocked airflow. Pieces placed too far apart meant the heat wasn't concentrated enough to keep good burning going. Experience taught the right spacing. As the embers heated the newly added peat, changes became visible. The peat darkened where it touched the coals. Wisps of smoke appeared. Then small flames came up. Not large leaping flames, but smaller, steadier flames that grew slowly. More peat was added piece by piece. The firekeeper worked carefully. Adding too much at once would smother the fire. Adding too little would let it die down. Each addition was timed. Wait too long, and the fire would weaken. Add too soon, and the previous addition hadn't established enough burning to light the next. The firekeeper watched the flames and judged the right moment. The fire grew. Heat spread from the stone-lined pit. Light increased throughout the hall. The flames were now visible along most of the hearth's length. Some wood was also added. Birch and pine burned hotter than peat, but used up faster. Wood was used for quick heat and better light during the active evening hours. Wood had been collected and stored during warmer months. Dead standing trees were preferred, already dried naturally. The wood was cut into manageable pieces and stored under cover to keep it dry through winter. Birch bark was especially valuable. The bark contained oils that made it burn easily, even when damp. A piece of birch bark could be used to help start flames when building up a low fire. The wood itself burned with a bright flame and pleasant smell. Pine contained resin that burned hot and bright. It made more smoke than birch, but gave excellent light. Pine was often saved for evening hours when maximum light was wanted. The wood pieces added now were about the length of a forearm and as thick as a wrist. These were placed on the established peat fire. The wood caught quickly from the heat beneath. Flames grew larger and brighter. The light in the hall increased noticeably. The firekeeper used a long wooden pole to adjust the smoke flaps in the roof. These flaps controlled how smoke escaped and how air came in. Proper adjustment kept the fire burning well and reduced smoke in the living area. The smoke flaps were placed near the peak of the roof where smoke naturally gathered. Each flap was a wooden panel that could be moved from inside using poles. The poles were long enough to reach from floor level to the roof, maybe 12 to 15 feet. The flaps could be opened wider or closed more. Opening them increased the draft, pulling more air into the building and drawing smoke out faster. Closing them partially kept more heat, but reduced smoke removal. Wind direction affected how the flap should be placed. Wind blowing across the roof created a Venturi effect. Faster moving air over the opening created lower pressure that helped draw smoke out. But if the wind blew directly into an opening, it could push smoke back down into the living space. The firekeeper had to understand the relationship between wind and draft. Tonight, with little wind, the flaps were placed to create a steady, moderate draw. The openings were maybe halfway open, enough to remove smoke, but not so much that too much heat was lost. In strong winds, the flaps might need frequent adjustment as the wind direction changed. On very cold nights with no wind, the flaps might be nearly closed to keep maximum heat, accepting higher smoke levels as a trade-off for warmth. The firekeeper could judge proper adjustment by watching the smoke. If smoke built up rapidly in the living space, more draft was needed. If the fire burned too strongly and used fuel rapidly, less draft was appropriate. The fire responded. It burned more strongly. The flames danced and jumped. Heat filled the space around the hearth, pushing back the cold that pressed against the thick walls. The temperature near the fire increased noticeably within minutes. Someone sitting 6 feet from the hearth could feel the difference. The radiant heat reached farther into the hall. The light changed the space. Where the hall had been dim with only low fire glow, it was now bright enough for detailed work. Shadows still moved with the flames. but people could see clearly to do their evening tasks. This fire would burn all night. It would be carefully tended, fed at intervals, never allowed to die. It was the heart of the home, the source of all warmth and light through the long darkness. The responsibility was important. A fire allowed to go out completely was hard to restart. Fire-starting methods existed. Striking steel against flint to create sparks, or using a fire bow to create friction heat. But these were time-consuming and not certain to work, especially in cold conditions. Keeping a continuous fire through winter was standard practice. The fire that burned tonight had likely been burning since autumn. It would continue until spring. Each day's fire was built from the previous night's embers. The chain was unbroken. This continuity meant security. As long as the fire burned, the household had heat and light. The fire's continuation was life's continuation. At the far end of the longhouse behind the partition, the family's animals lived in their space. 3 cows, 6 sheep, and several goats lived here through the winter. They had been brought inside in autumn when outdoor conditions became too harsh. The first severe frosts made outdoor survival difficult for livestock. Once inside, they would remain until spring returned and temperatures became mild enough for grazing again. The decision to bring animals inside was made carefully. Timing mattered. Too early, and the animals would use up winter feed supplies unnecessarily. Too late, and they risked exposure to the dangerous cold. Experience taught families to watch for specific signs. Persistent ground frost, ice forming on water sources, and the first heavy snowfall. The animals themselves seemed to understand the routine. After the first winter or two, cattle recognized when they were being moved to indoor quarters. They accepted the change without resistance. Sheep and goats, more nervous by nature, still needed some coaxing, but eventually settled. Evening meant feeding time. Someone brought dried hay and scattered it in the feeding areas. The animals moved to eat. This was usually a job given to one of the children or younger household members. A bundle of hay was taken from storage, either from within the byre itself or from the storage areas beneath the sleeping platforms. The hay had been cut during the summer, dried thoroughly, and stored for winter use. The feeding troughs were simple wooden structures along the walls of the byre. The hay was spread out among them, so the animals didn't have to compete too much. Cattle, being larger and more dominant, would push sheep aside if all the feed were in one place. Spreading it out reduced conflict. The animals responded immediately to feeding. They moved from resting positions to the troughs. The sounds increased, the tearing of hay, the rhythmic chewing, the occasional low call from a cow or bleat from a sheep. Feeding time was active time in the byre. Each cow produced significant heat. A large animal's metabolism creates thermal energy constantly. A mature cow weighing 1,000 pounds produces roughly as much heat as a small space heater. About 1,500 watts of thermal output. 3 cows created a substantial heat output, equal to a significant heating system. This heat production was continuous and automatic. The cows didn't need to be doing anything active. Simply maintaining body temperature and digesting food created this thermal energy. At night, when the animals rested, the heat production continued at nearly the same rate. The sheep and goats added to this effect. Though smaller individually, together they contributed measurably. A sheep produces maybe 300 watts of heat. 6 sheep meant another 1,800 watts. Several goats added more. The combined animal heat raised the temperature of the entire building by several degrees, maybe 3 to 5 degrees, depending on outside temperature and building size. This temperature increase was significant. In a building that might otherwise be at 15 degrees, the animal contribution brought it to 18 or 20 degrees. That difference affected comfort levels and reduced the burden on the central fire. The heat wasn't concentrated in the byre. The low partition allowed warm air to flow freely into the main hall. Warm air rises, and the air warmed by the animals naturally moved upward and over the barrier. This created a gentle circulation pattern that spread the heat throughout the building. This arrangement served multiple purposes. The animals survived the winter, protected from conditions that would have killed them outdoors. The family gained a reliable extra heat source that required only feeding to maintain. The animals also provided fresh milk throughout the cold months. Milk production continued through winter, though at reduced levels compared to summer. The cows, if they had calved at the right time of year, would still be producing milk. This provided fresh dairy, a valuable source of fat and protein during months when other fresh foods were unavailable. The milk was used immediately or processed into butter and cheese. Even small amounts of milk were valuable. A cup of milk added to porridge made it more nutritious and filling. Butter enriched bread and other foods. The ongoing milk production made keeping cattle indoors worthwhile beyond just the heat they provided. The sounds from the byre were part of the household background. Cattle breathing, sheep occasionally bleating, animals shifting position. These were familiar constant sounds. The breathing of large animals is audible. 3 cows produce a steady sound of inhalation and exhalation. At night, when the household was quiet, this breathing could be clearly heard. It wasn't disturbing. It was familiar, even comforting. The sounds confirmed that the animals were alive and well. Occasionally, an animal would make sounds. A cow might low softly. A sheep might bleat, especially if jostled by another animal at the feeding trough. Goats made their characteristic sounds. These noises broke up the background hum of animal presence. Movement sounds were also constant. Animals shifted their weight from one leg to another. They lay down and stood up. Hooves scraped against the packed earth floor. Hay rustled as they pulled it from the troughs. The byre was a zone of continuous low-level activity. The partition allowed air circulation between the 2 spaces. Warm air from the animals flowed into the main hall. The family could also watch the livestock easily through the low barrier. The waist-high partition meant that anyone standing in the main hall could look over into the byre. Visual monitoring was simple. A glance confirmed that animals were eating normally, that none appeared sick or injured, that all were present and accounted for. This easy monitoring was important. Livestock represented significant wealth. A cow was a major asset. Losing one to illness or injury was a serious economic blow. Regular observation allowed problems to be spotted early. An animal not eating might be becoming sick. One lying down too much might be injured. Constant monitoring protected the family's investment. The open top of the partition also meant that communication across the barrier was easy. Someone working in the main hall could speak to someone tending animals in the byre without difficulty. Instructions could be given, questions asked, problems reported, all without physically moving between the spaces. This system showed efficient use of resources. Nothing was wasted. The animals that would provide food, milk, and wool also contributed to heating the home. The efficiency was typical of Viking survival strategies. Every element served multiple purposes. The livestock weren't just future food or sources of milk and wool. They were active participants in the household's heat management system during the months when survival depended on keeping adequate warmth. The arrangement also showed understanding of heat transfer, though not in those terms. The Vikings recognized that large animals produced heat and that this heat could be captured and used. The design of the Longhouse with its integrated byre and low partition showed that this principle had been refined over generations. As the animals settled into their evening routine, their contribution to the household's warmth was already at work. The air temperature in the hall was measurably higher than it would have been without them. This difference would matter through the long night ahead. With the livestock fed and settled, attention returned to the human side of the partition. The evening meal was the next focus, and preparation for it was already underway. With the fire built up, food preparation began. The evening meal was important for nutrition, but also for warming the body before sleep. An iron cauldron hung from a chain over the fire. It had been in place all day, but was now filled for cooking. The cauldron was a valuable piece of equipment. Iron was expensive and required skilled metal workers to make. A household's cauldron might be used for decades, passed down through generations. The size varied, but a typical family cauldron held maybe 2 to 3 gallons. The iron was thick enough to handle the heat of the fire without cracking or warping. The cauldron had a rounded bottom that fit naturally over the fire. 3 short legs on some cauldrons allowed them to stand directly in the coals, though this cauldron hung from a chain. The chain was also iron, forged with links strong enough to support the weight of the cauldron, plus its contents, maybe 40 or 50 pounds total when full. The chain attached to the cauldron's handle, a curved iron bar riveted to the cauldron's sides. The upper end of the chain attached to a wooden beam that stretched above the hearth. This beam was placed high enough that the hanging cauldron was at the right height over the fire. The exact height could be changed by switching which link of the chain was hooked to the beam. The household's cook got ingredients from storage. Salted pork preserved since autumn butchering. Root vegetables stored in sand, turnips, carrots, onions, barley grain from a sealed container. The pork had been butchered months earlier during late autumn, when temperatures dropped enough to prevent spoilage during processing. The meat was cut into portions and packed in salt. The salt pulled moisture from the meat and created an environment where bacteria couldn't grow. This preserved meat was hard and very salty. It needed soaking before cooking to remove extra salt and rehydrate the flesh. If used right away, it would make the stew inedible. Some households prepared by soaking the meat earlier in the day. Others used less salted pieces that could go directly into the pot. The root vegetables had been harvested before the first hard frost. They were stored in boxes filled with sand, which kept them cool and moist without allowing them to rot. The sand prevented vegetables from touching each other, which reduced rot spread if one vegetable did spoil. Turnips were hardy and stored well. They provided bulk and some nutrition. Carrots were less common, but valuable for their sweetness. Onions added flavor and also stored well if kept dry. The barley was from the household's grain harvest. After threshing to separate grain from stalks, the barley had been stored in leather bags sealed against moisture and pests. Barley was versatile. It could be ground into flour, used whole in stews, or made into porridge. Water went into the cauldron first. Then the ingredients were added. Meat first, as it took the longest to soften. Vegetables next, cut into chunks. Finally, grain, which would thicken the stew. The water came from whatever source remained accessible. In early winter, this might be a stream or spring. Later in winter, when most water sources froze, the snow would be melted. The cauldron was filled about 2/3 full, enough for cooking, but leaving room for ingredients and to prevent boiling over. The salted pork went in first. The pieces were cut into chunks roughly 2 inches across. They sank to the bottom of the cold water. As the water heated, the meat would gradually soften and flavor the liquid. The vegetables were prepared on the floor near the fire. A wooden board served as a cutting surface. A sharp knife cut the turnips, carrots, and onions into chunks. The pieces needed to be large enough not to fall apart during long cooking, but small enough to cook through. The chunks went into the cauldron. They floated at first, then gradually sank as they absorbed water. The water level rose with each addition. Finally, the barley was added. A wooden scoop measured out maybe 2 cups of grain. The barley scattered across the surface, the individual grains slowly sinking. The barley would absorb water and swell during cooking, thickening the stew into a hearty consistency. This stew, called scouse, would simmer for several hours. The long cooking time broke down tough meat and blended flavors. The term scouse referred to this type of one-pot meal, meat, vegetables, and grain cooked together. It was standard fare during winter. The exact contents varied based on what was available, but the idea remained the same. The cauldron hung at a height where the fire's heat reached it steadily, but the flames didn't touch it directly. The water began to warm. Small bubbles appeared on the bottom of the cauldron. Steam started to rise from the surface. As the temperature increased, more bubbles formed. Eventually, the liquid reached a simmer, not a rolling boil, but gentle bubbling. This temperature was kept for hours. The low, steady heat slowly cooked everything. The meat fibers gradually broke down, becoming tender. The vegetables softened. The barley absorbed liquid and released starch, thickening the broth. The salt from the meat seasoned everything. The onions provided aromatic flavor. The long cooking blended all the flavors. What started as separate ingredients became a unified stew. The liquid became rich with dissolved proteins and starches. The texture became thick and satisfying. The meal was deliberately high in calories and fat. This was practical. The body needed fuel to create internal heat. Fat and protein provided sustained energy that would last through the night. Fat contains more than twice the calories per weight as protein or carbohydrate. The pork fat in the stew provided concentrated energy. A serving with good fat content could contain 500 calories or more. Protein from the meat supported muscle function and provided amino acids for body maintenance. The metabolic processing of protein also creates heat as a byproduct. Carbohydrates from the barley and vegetables provided glucose for immediate energy needs and glycogen storage for overnight metabolic requirements. The combination created a meal optimized for cold weather survival. It wasn't about taste, though the stew was flavorful. It was about providing the fuel the body needed to maintain temperature through a long, cold night. Flatbread had been prepared earlier on hot stones. It would go with the stew. Butter from the family's cows would be available as well. Flatbread was made from barley or oat flour mixed with water into a dough. The dough was formed into thin rounds and cooked on flat stones placed near the fire. The stones were heated until they could cook the bread hot enough that a drop of water would sizzle immediately. The bread cooked quickly on the hot stones, maybe 2 to 3 minutes per side. It came out crisp and slightly browned. Made without leavening, it was dense but filling. Butter added calories and made the bread more palatable. The butter was made from cream skimmed from the cow's milk. The cream was churned, agitated until the fat globules separated from the liquid. The resulting butter was salted for preservation and stored in sealed containers. Some households also made porridge as a supplement. Oats or barley, boiled with water and enriched with butter. This provided additional calories for those who wanted more food. Porridge was simple to make. Grain was added to boiling water and stirred as it cooked. The grain absorbed water and swelled. After maybe 20 minutes of cooking, the porridge was thick and ready to eat. Butter stirred in, while hot added richness. A bit of honey, if available, provided sweetness. The cooking process added heat and moisture to the air. Steam rose from the cauldron. The smell of cooking food filled the hall. The steam carried heat energy into the air. While most heat energy stayed in the liquid being cooked, the escaping steam warmed the surrounding air noticeably. Someone standing near the cooking pot would feel this warmth distinctly. The moisture from the steam increased the humidity in the hall. The air in winter was typically dry, especially indoors where cold air held little moisture. The cooking steam helped moderate this dryness, making breathing more comfortable. The smell of the cooking stew was powerful and everywhere. It dominated all other smells in the hall. The scent of meat, onions, and grain cooking together created an aroma that signaled food, warmth, and security. For people who had been smelling wood smoke and earth all day, the cooking smell was a welcome change. The smell also stimulated appetite. The body's response to food aromas included increased saliva production and digestive preparation. By the time the stew was ready, everyone was hungry and ready to eat. The meal would be eaten together with the household gathered around the fire. This was standard practice during winter evenings. Eating together strengthened social bonds and made sure everyone received adequate nutrition. As the stew cooked, family members naturally moved toward the central fire. This was the warmest location in the social center of the home. The gathering was gradual but consistent. As individuals finished their tasks in other parts of the hall, they moved to positions near the hearth. The pole was both physical, seeking warmth, and social, seeking company. People continued working on small tasks. Leather needed mending. Tools needed sharpening. Wool could be spun. These activities could be done while sitting near the heat. A man might sit on the sleeping platform with a knife and whetstone, sharpening the blade with practice strokes. The repetitive motion required little concentration, allowing him to take part in conversation while working. A woman might have a spindle and a distaff, continuing the endless work of turning wool into thread. The spinning could continue almost automatically once the technique was mastered. Her hands worked while her attention was free for social interaction. Older children helped with various tasks. A boy might be smoothing a wooden handle with a piece of rough stone, rubbing away splinters and irregularities. A girl might be carding wool, combing it with toothed tools to align the fibers for spinning. These activities kept hands busy, but didn't prevent conversation. The work was familiar enough that it required little focused attention. Children sat on the floor near the fire, playing quiet games or listening to adult conversation. They stayed close to the warmth. Young children had limited tolerance for cold. Their smaller body mass meant they lost heat faster relative to heat production. Keeping them near the fire was necessary for their comfort and safety. The games played were quiet and contained. Loud running games were impossible in the confined space and would disturb the household. Instead, children played with simple toys, carved wooden figures, small stones used as game pieces, or pieces of string for making patterns. Some children simply listened to the adults. They absorbed the conversations, the stories, the rhythms of winter evening life. This was their education, observing, listening, and gradually learning the patterns of their culture. The household included parents, children, grandparents, and possibly unmarried relatives or servants. All lived together in this single space. Privacy wasn't part of the arrangement. A typical household might number 8 to 12 people. 2 parents formed the core. Several children of varying ages, maybe 4 or 5, represented the next generation. 1 or both grandparents might live with the family if still alive. An unmarried adult sibling or a servant who worked for the family might complete the household. Everyone had a place in the social hierarchy. The head of the household, typically the senior man, had final authority over household decisions. His wife managed domestic operations and had authority over indoor work. Elders were respected and consulted. Children occupied the lowest status, but were valued for their labor and as future adults. This hierarchy was visible in the spatial arrangement. The head of household occupied a position near the fire's warmest zone. His wife sat nearby. Elders were positioned favorably. Children and servants occupied outer positions or moved between spots as needed. Conversation was part of the evening routine. People discussed the day's work, made plans for the next day, and shared information. This social interaction was important during the long months of winter confinement. Topics varied. Plans for the next day's work, what needed doing, who would do what, observations about the animals, which cows seemed to be producing less milk, and whether the sheep appeared healthy. Comments about the weather, how cold it felt, whether snow seemed likely. Stories from the past came up. Someone might recall a previous winter that had been particularly harsh or particularly mild. Memories of family members no longer present might be shared. These recollections kept the past alive and strengthened family identity. Information from outside the household was valuable. If someone had encountered a neighbor during the day, news would be shared. Word about other families. Community plans or unusual events spread through these evening conversations. Conflicts or tensions were addressed in close quarters. Disagreements were inevitable. The evening gathering provided an opportunity to discuss and resolve issues before they got worse. The presence of the entire household encouraged measured responses and collective problem-solving. The fire provided the focus. Everyone is oriented toward it. The heat it produced made the evening bearable. Without it, the space would quickly become too cold to occupy comfortably. The fire was both a literal and a symbolic center. Literally, it was the heat source. Symbolically, it represented home, safety, and community. The household gathered around it as they would around no other feature of the Longhouse. The flickering light created a particular atmosphere. Faces were lit from below and from the side, creating shadows that moved with the flames. The effect was intimate and slightly mysterious. Features were visible, but not harshly lit as they would be in bright daylight. The warmth was strongest near the fire and decreased with distance. People naturally clustered within the zone of good warmth, maybe within 8 to 10 feet of the hearth. Beyond that, the temperature dropped enough that sitting was less comfortable. The gathering also served to keep everyone in the warmest zone of the building. Rather than spreading out into colder areas, the household clustered where the heat was strongest. This reduced individual discomfort and reduced the heating burden on the fire. If people had spread throughout the hall, the fire would need to be much larger to warm all those areas adequately. By clustering, they allowed the fire to work efficiently. The concentrated heat served everyone adequately. This pattern would continue for several hours, working on small tasks, talking, staying close to the fire's warmth. The household existed as a unit, sharing space and warmth and time. When the stew was ready, the household ate together. Wooden bowls were distributed. The cook ladled stew into each bowl. The bowls were simple wooden vessels carved from single pieces of wood. Each bowl was roughly the size of 2 cupped hands. The wood was smoothed from use but showed wear. Small scratches in darkened areas where hands had held it thousands of times. Each household member had a customary bowl. These weren't marked or decorated in most households, but people knew which bowl was theirs through familiarity. The slight variations in size, shape, and wear pattern made each bowl distinctive. The distribution followed household hierarchy. The head of household received his bowl first, then his wife, then the elders, then other adults. Children received theirs last. This order reinforced social structure while making sure everyone was served. The cook used a wooden ladle to transfer stew from the cauldron to the bowls. The ladle was deep enough to bring up both liquid and solid pieces, meat, vegetables, grain. Each serving aimed to include a fair portion of everything. The portions were substantial. The bowl might be filled 3/4 full, enough to be filling, but not so much that it would cool too quickly. A serving likely contained 12 to 16 ounces of stew. The food was hot. Steam rose from each serving. The temperature of the food itself provided immediate warming. The sensation of eating something hot was comforting in the cold environment. The first bite or spoonful would be almost too hot to eat comfortably. People learned to blow on the food or wait briefly before eating. As the meal progressed, the food cooled to a more comfortable temperature, but remained warm throughout most of the meal. Eating utensils were simple. Most people used a wooden spoon. Some might eat directly from the bowl, drinking the liquid and using fingers or pieces of bread to get solid pieces. The method was practical rather than refined. Wooden spoons were carved from single pieces of wood. The bowl of the spoon was relatively shallow, more like a modern dessert spoon than a soup spoon. The handle was short and thick, easy to grip. The spoon showed wear from use. The bowl end was worn smoother than the handle. The stew was thick and rich. The fat from the pork provided concentrated calories. The vegetables and grain added substance. This was hearty food designed for survival, not refined taste. The texture was substantial. The meat had cooked long enough to be tender, but still provided resistance when chewed. The vegetables were soft, but not dissolved. The barley had swelled and thickened the liquid into something between soup and porridge. The flavor was simple but satisfying. The salt from the preserved pork seasoned everything. The onions provided savory depth. The barley added a mild, slightly nutty flavor. The overall taste was hearty and filling rather than complex or delicate. The fat content was noticeable. Small globules of melted pork fat floated on the surface and coated the mouth when eating. This fattiness was desirable. It provided the calorie density needed for cold weather survival. A thin, lean stew would not have sustained people adequately. Flatbread was torn and used to soak up the stew. Butter was spread on extra bread. The meal was filling and warming. The flatbread served multiple purposes. It could be used as a utensil. Torn pieces picked up solid food from the bowl. It soaked up liquid at the bottom of the bowl, making sure nothing was wasted. It provided additional calories and bulk. The bread had a dense texture and a slightly nutty flavor from the barley or oat flour. It was somewhat chewy, requiring good teeth to eat. Dipped in the stew, it softened and absorbed flavors. Butter on bread added significant calories, maybe 50 calories per small pat of butter. For people needing maximum calorie intake, buttered bread was an efficient way to consume fat. The butter also made the bread more palatable and easier to swallow. Some people might have a second serving if the stew remained in the pot. Growing children and adults who had done heavy physical work would eat more. Smaller children and elders might not finish their first serving. Eating creates heat through digestion. The metabolic process of breaking down food, especially fatty food, produces thermal energy. This internal heat generation would continue for hours after the meal. The thermic effect of food is real and measurable. The body uses energy breaking down food molecules and absorbing nutrients. For fat, about 5 to 15% of the calories consumed are burned in the digestive process itself. For protein, the percentage is higher, 20 to 30%. This means that eating 500 calories of fatty protein-rich stew resulted in immediate heat production of maybe 50 to 100 calories. This heat warmed the body from within, adding to the external heat from the fire. The timing of the evening meal was strategic. Eaten several hours before sleep, the digestive heat production peaked during the early part of the night, exactly when it was most needed. As people settled to sleep and the fire was banked lower, their bodies were warm from both the meal and the peak of the evening fire. The filling sensation from eating also contributed to comfort. A full stomach created a sense of satisfaction and contentment. This psychological comfort combined with physical warmth to create optimal conditions for the evening's remainder. The evening meal was the main meal of the day. It provided the caloric input that would fuel the body through the long night. In winter, when outdoor work was limited and daylight was brief, this meal might account for half or more of daily calorie intake. Daily calorie needs in cold weather are higher than in moderate temperatures. The body burns calories, maintaining core temperature. Physical work requires energy. Growth in children demands calories. A household member might need 2,500 to 3,500 calories per day depending on age, size, and activity level. The evening stew with bread and butter could easily provide 800 to 1,200 calories per person. Combined with morning and midday meals, maybe porridge and bread, total intake reached adequate levels. The diet wasn't varied or elaborate, but it provided sufficient energy for survival. After eating, wooden bowls were set aside. Some water might be drunk, but beverages were minimal. The focus was on the solid, calorie-dense food. Water was consumed as needed, but wasn't a major part of the meal. The stew itself was liquid enough to provide some hydration. Excessive drinking was avoided. Water took up stomach space, better used for calorie-dense food. If water was drunk, it was at room temperature, which meant cold. Heating water for drinking was possible, but the fuel used could have been better spent on cooking or heating the living space. People tolerated cold water as normal. The bowls were stacked or placed in a designated area. They would be cleaned later, maybe the next morning when someone could take them outside briefly or use snow to scrub them. For now, they were simply set aside. The meal brought the household together in a shared activity. Everyone ate at the same time in the same space. This strengthened social bonds and provided a sense of community. Communal eating was standard practice. There was no concept of individuals eating at different times or in different locations. The household ate as a unit. This made sure everyone received adequate nutrition and that no one was overlooked or forgotten. The shared meal was also a time when the household was most completely gathered and focused on a common activity. Work might scatter people to different tasks, but during the meal, everyone was present and engaged in the same act, consuming the food that sustained them all. With the meal finished, the evening routine would continue. There were still hours before sleep. The fire would be maintained. Activities would continue near the hearth. But an important milestone had been reached. The household was fed and warm, positioned to survive another night. After the evening meal, the household continued with various tasks. These activities kept people busy during the long dark hours and made good use of time. Women worked on textile production. This included spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into cloth, or sewing and mending garments. These tasks needed good light, so they were done close to the fire. Spinning was continuous work during winter months. A woman would sit with a distaff holding prepared wool fibers and a spindle for twisting them into thread. The work was repetitive, but needed attention. A skilled spinner could produce substantial lengths of thread in an evening. Sewing and mending happened constantly. Clothing wore out from use. Tiers needed repair. A woman might sit with a wool tunic across her lap, stitching with a bone or metal needle and wool thread. Men sharpened tools, repaired equipment, or worked on wooden items. Knives needed edges. Axe handles needed smoothing. Broken tools needed fixing. Much of this work could be done while sitting near the warmth. A man would sit with a wet stone, drawing the blade across it repeatedly. The scraping sound was distinctive. Wooden items could be shaped from prepared wood handles for tools, bowls, or simple repairs. Children might help with simple tasks or play quiet games. Older children could spin wool or help with basic repairs. Younger ones stayed close to adults, absorbing the patterns of winter evening life. Even small children contributed. Holding materials steady or fetching tools from storage freed hands for detailed work. These small contributions taught children that everyone had a role. These activities served multiple purposes. They were productive. Necessary work was accomplished. They were social. People worked alongside each other and talked. They kept the household together in the warmest part of the building. The work rhythm was steady but not rushed. There was no time pressure. The darkness outside would last for many hours. Tasks were paced to fill the evening without exhausting people before sleep. Periodically, someone would add fuel to the fire. This happened at regular intervals, part of the background rhythm of the evening. The fire was never allowed to burn too low. The hours passed in this pattern, working, talking, tending the fire, staying warm. Eventually, as the evening progressed, thoughts would turn toward sleep. As the evening wore on, work activities gradually decreased. This was the time for oral tradition, the telling of stories that preserved history, culture, and practical knowledge. Elders held most of the stories. They had heard them from previous generations and had memorized them through years of repetition. Now they passed them on. An elder might be a grandfather in his 60s or 70s, old by Viking age standards when average life expectancy was maybe 40 to 50 years. Someone who had survived to an advanced age carried decades of accumulated knowledge and experience. These elders had learned stories in their own youth, sitting by fires just like this one, listening to their grandparents. They had heard the same stories dozens or hundreds of times over the years. Through this repetition, the stories became fixed in memory, word for word in some cases, or at least with consistent structure and key details. Now in their own old age, the elders held the responsibility of passing them on. They were the living libraries of their culture. What they knew and could remember was all that would survive them. If they failed to pass stories on, that knowledge would die with them. The storytelling typically began naturally. Someone might ask a question that prompts a relevant story, or an elder might simply announce that a particular tale should be told tonight. The household settled to listen. Stories served multiple functions. Some were entertainment, tales of heroes, gods, and mythical events from Norse tradition. These held attention and made the evening pass more pleasantly. The Norse sagas and myths were rich with dramatic narratives. Stories of the gods, Odin's gaining of wisdom, Thor's battles with giants, and Loki's tricks and betrayals provided entertainment while also conveying religious beliefs and moral lessons. Heroic sagas told of legendary warriors and leaders. These stories featured battles, feuds, journeys to distant lands, and tests of courage and honor. The narratives were exciting, filled with action and conflict. They held the attention of listeners, particularly children and young people. The entertainment value was real. In an environment with no books, no visual entertainment, and limited social contact outside the household, stories were precious. A good storyteller could transport listeners to other times and places, providing mental escape from the confines of the winter-long house. Other stories contained practical information embedded in narrative form. A tale about a hunting expedition might teach animal behavior and weather prediction. A story about a harsh winter might describe survival techniques. These practical stories were subtly educational. Rather than direct instruction, when tracking elk, look for these signs. The information was embedded in narrative. Gunnar followed the elk through the snow, noticing how the tracks were deeper on one side where the animal favored its good leg. A story about surviving an unexpectedly harsh winter might describe how a family rationed their food supplies, made use of alternative fuel sources, or kept spirits up during months of confinement. Listeners absorbed this information as part of an engaging story rather than as dry instruction. Stories about sea voyages contain navigation knowledge. How to read the stars, interpret wave patterns, and judge distance from land by observing birds and debris. This information was preserved in narrative form, making it memorable and accessible. Historical narratives preserved the memory of real events. Migrations, battles, important leaders, and significant changes were remembered through these oral accounts. Without written records, this was how history was maintained. The Vikings had no widespread written historical tradition. Runes existed and were used for short inscriptions, but extensive historical writing didn't develop until later. Before then, history lived in the memories of those who told stories. These historical narratives preserved collective memory. Where did the family come from originally? What important events had shaped their community? Who were significant ancestors? These stories provided cultural identity and continuity with the past. Some historical stories reach back generations. An elder might tell of events that happened before his own birth, stories he had heard from his grandmother, who had heard them from her grandfather. This created chains of memory stretching back maybe a century or more. The accuracy of these oral histories varied. Core details, names, major events, significant outcomes were likely preserved reasonably well. Minor details and exact sequences were more subject to change over time, but the existence of the tradition meant that important historical knowledge wasn't entirely lost. The storytelling format made information memorable. Details were more likely to be retained when embedded in narrative form. Young people learned by hearing the same stories repeated year after year. Memory researchers have confirmed what oral cultures knew intuitively. Narrative structure helps retention. Information organized into a story with characters, sequence, and cause and effect is remembered better than isolated facts. The repetition was key. A child might hear the same story 5 or 10 times over the course of their childhood. Each hearing reinforced the memory. By adulthood, the story was deeply embedded. When they became elders, they could reproduce it accurately for the next generation. The stories also used poetic devices that helped memory. Alliteration, rhythmic patterns, repeated phrases. These features made the language more memorable. Some stories were told in verse, which added structure that helped fix the words in memory. Children listened carefully. They were expected to remember these stories and eventually tell them to the next generation. This was their education. Oral, communal, and continuous. For children, this wasn't passive entertainment. It was active learning. They weren't merely being amused. They were being prepared for their future roles as carriers of cultural knowledge. Older children might be asked to repeat parts of a story they had heard. This tested their retention and began their practice as storytellers. A grandfather might say, "Now you tell the part about when Ragnar's ship encountered the storm." The child would try to reproduce that section, while the elder listened and corrected errors. This practice was essential training. By adolescence, a young person should be able to retell several complete stories from memory. By adulthood, they should have mastered dozens. By old age, they would be the keepers of a vast oral library. The learning was gradual and natural. Children first absorbed stories through repeated listening. Then they began practicing portions. Eventually, they could reproduce entire narratives. The process took years, but required no formal schooling, just participation in these winter evening gatherings. The rhythm of storytelling fit well with the evening setting. A voice speaking steadily, the crackling fire, the darkness outside, all created an atmosphere good for focused listening. The storyteller typically sat in a prominent position, maybe on the sleeping platform near the fire, where they could be seen and heard clearly. The firelight illuminated their face from below, creating dramatic shadows that added to the atmosphere. The voice was the primary tool. Volume and pacing were adjusted to keep engagement. Exciting passages might be delivered more rapidly with higher intensity. Sad or solemn passages might slow down with lower, more measured tones. The variation kept listeners engaged. Some storytellers added gestures, hands miming the swing of a sword, arms spread to show vastness, facial expressions showing fear or joy. These physical elements enhanced the narrative and helped listeners visualize scenes. The crackling of the fire provided a background rhythm. The sounds were irregular but constant. Small pops as pockets of moisture in the fuel vaporized, soft hisses as gases escaped, occasional louder snaps as pieces shifted in the hearth. These sounds punctuated the storyteller's voice without overwhelming it. The darkness outside was complete. There were no streetlights, no neighboring windows, no ambient light of any kind. The world beyond the walls might as well not have existed. This isolation focused attention inward on the voice and the fire and the gathered household. The combination created an almost hypnotic atmosphere. Listeners could lose themselves in the narrative, their minds engaged with the story, while their bodies remained warm and still by the fire. Stories could continue for a long time. A full saga might take an hour or more to tell. This helped pass the long winter evenings when outdoor activity was impossible. The longer narratives were told in installments. Sometimes a particularly complex saga might be begun one evening and continued on later nights. This created anticipation. People looked forward to hearing what happened next. The length was also practical. Evening hours stretched ahead with little to fill them. A long story provided entertainment and education for a substantial portion of that time. The household could settle in and let the narrative carry them through the cold darkness. Some stories were told annually, particular tales associated with certain times of year or occasions. Yule, the midwinter festival, had its own stories. Other seasonal markers had associated narratives. This created a ritual quality to the storytelling tradition. The annual repetition meant people knew what was coming. They had heard these stories every year for their entire lives. But this familiarity was comforting rather than boring. The stories were like old friends welcomed back each year. Children grew up with the seasonal stories marking time. The telling of a particular tale meant it was a certain point in the winter. This helped create time structure in the long, dark months when one day blended into another. The social aspects of winter storytelling created opportunities for community bonding that helped maintain positive relationships during the stressful period of winter confinement. Shared laughter, emotional responses to familiar narratives, and the comfortable closeness of firelit gatherings helped families and communities maintain the social cohesion essential for successful winter survival. Listening together created a shared experience. When something exciting or dramatic happened in a story, the household responded together, leaning forward, gasping, laughing. These shared emotional moments strengthened bonds between people. The storytelling also provided a framework for discussing values and behavior. After a story about a heroic figure, conversation might turn to what made someone brave or honorable. Stories about conflicts might prompt discussion about proper ways to resolve disputes. The narratives provided material for moral education for people confined together for months. Maintaining good relationships was essential. The storytelling tradition provided a structured time when everyone took part in a shared positive activity. This helped prevent the conflicts and tensions that could arise from prolonged close quarters. By mid-evening, the fire reached its peak output. It had been built up after sunset and maintained throughout the meal and evening activities. Now it burned strong and steady. The flames rose a foot or more above the stone-lined hearth. The light illuminated the central portion of the hall. Shadows moved on the walls as flames shifted. The height and strength of the flames indicated peak burning. The fuel peat and wood was burning efficiently. Oxygen was adequate. Heat output was at its maximum for the evening. The flame patterns varied with the type of fuel. Wood produced taller, more active flames that leaped and danced. Peat created lower, steadier flames that moved more slowly. The combination created complex, ever-changing patterns of light. The light quality was warm with yellow and orange tones dominating. This warm light was flattering to skin tones and created a comfortable atmosphere. Unlike the harsh blue-white light of daylight, firelight was soft and forgiving. The illuminated area extended maybe 12 to 15 feet from the hearth in all directions. Within this zone, visibility was good enough for detailed work. People could see each other's faces clearly, could work on crafts requiring precision, and could move about safely. Beyond this central zone, the light faded gradually. The sleeping platform areas received some light, but were dimmer. The corners of the hall, the storage areas beneath platforms, the byre at the far end, these were in deep shadow or nearly complete darkness. Heat spread in all directions from the fire. The air directly around the hearth was warm, maybe even uncomfortably, so if sitting too close. This warmth extended outward and gradually decreased in intensity. The temperature at the hearth's edge might reach 70 or 80 degrees, genuinely warm by any standard. At 6 feet away, it might be 60 degrees. At 10 feet, maybe 50 degrees. At the walls, closer to 40 degrees. This temperature gradient meant that people could position themselves according to their needs. Someone cold could move closer. Someone who became too warm could shift back. The flexibility allowed individual comfort within the communal space. The raised sleeping platforms along the walls received heat from the fire. They were positioned to benefit from radial heat distribution. At this point in the evening, with the fire at full strength, even the sleeping areas were reasonably warm. The platforms being elevated were in a slightly warmer air layer than the floor. The radiant heat from the fire reached them directly without being blocked by furniture or obstacles. The result was that the sleeping surfaces were probably around 50 degrees, cold by modern standards, but survivable with adequate bedding. The edge of the platforms nearest the fire was warmer than the edge against the wall. This created another temperature gradient across the width of the platform. People sleeping later would position themselves according to this gradient, with those needing more warmth closer to the fireside. The upper reaches of the hall remained filled with smoke. This was normal. The smoke carried heat upward before escaping through the roof vents. This rising heat helped warm the entire volume of air in the building. The smoke layer acted as a heat barrier of sorts. The hot smoke near the ceiling reduced heat loss through the roof. While smoke certainly escaped through the vents, the layer itself held heat that would otherwise have been lost immediately to the outside air. The temperature in the smoke layer was significantly higher than at floor level, maybe 70 or 80 degrees, compared to 50 degrees lower down. This hot upper zone was uninhabitable, but its existence contributed to the overall thermal environment. The fire's light allowed continued activity. People could see well enough to work on detailed tasks. The quality of light wasn't like daylight. It flickered and created moving shadows, but it was adequate for the needs of evening work. Spinning could continue by firelight. The spinner could see the wool fibers clearly enough to maintain consistent thickness. Weaving was possible, though more challenging. The firelight could make it harder to detect errors in the pattern. Sharpening tools was manageable. A person could see the blade edge well enough to maintain the correct angle against the wet stone. Carving wood was possible for simple shapes, but detailed work might be left for daylight hours. Sewing and mending were at the limits of what firelight allowed. Threading a needle was difficult in the flickering light. Following stitch lines on dark wool was challenging, but simple repairs, reattaching a leather strap, or stitching a large tier were feasible. This was the warmest the Longhouse would be all day. The fire at full strength, the room filled with people generating body heat, the animals adding their warmth from behind the partition, all combined to create the most comfortable conditions. The combined heat output was substantial. The fire might produce 10,000 to 15,000 BTUs per hour at full burn. The animals contributed maybe another 5,000 BTUs. The 10 or so people in the household added roughly 2,000 BTUs from their collective body heat. Together, these sources produced maybe 20,000 BTUs or more. This heat output raised the interior temperature well above outside temperatures. If it was 0 degrees outside, the interior might average 50 degrees, a difference of 50 degrees maintained by this combination of heat sources. The thick walls prevented rapid heat loss. Their thermal mass meant they warmed slowly, but also cooled slowly. The walls had absorbed heat during the day and evening, and now radiated some of that heat back into the interior, helping maintain the temperature. The turf walls, several feet thick, had a high thermal mass. The outer surface might be near the outside temperature, but the inner layers were warmer. The temperature gradient through the wall thickness meant the inner surface was significantly warmer than the outside air, radiating heat inward rather than conducting cold inward. Later, as people prepared for sleep, the fire would be banked down. But for now, it burned strong, the glowing heart of the home. The fire's current state represented peak comfort and security. The household was warm, fed, and gathered together. The night's dangers, cold, darkness, isolation, were held at bay by the fire's power. This moment of peak warmth was appreciated, even if not consciously acknowledged. People had been cold during the day, working outdoors or in cold parts of the building. Now they were genuinely warm, maybe even comfortable. The contrast made the warmth more precious. The fire also represented continuity. This wasn't a new fire, but the continuation of a fire that had burned for months. Tomorrow it would burn again. This fire connected them to yesterday and to tomorrow, to the past and the future. As long as it burned, they survived. As the evening progressed toward night, the youngest children were prepared for sleep first. They needed more rest than adults and were more vulnerable to cold. Parents checked the sleeping platform areas. The bedding had been arranged during the day, but now it was examined to make sure everything was in place for the night. Children were dressed in their sleep clothing. This wasn't specialized nightwear, but simply their undergarments, linen or light wool tunics. These were kept on. Removing clothes would mean losing the warmth they provided. The children were directed to the sleeping platforms. These were along the walls raised above the floor. The elevation helped. Cold air settled at floor level, so being higher meant being warmer. Younger children would sleep between adults. This positioning was deliberate. Adult bodies generated more heat. A child placed between two adults would be kept warm by their body heat throughout the night. The children climbed onto the platform and moved under the layers of bedding. This consisted of furs and woolen blankets stacked to provide insulation from above and below. Parents tucked additional coverings around the children. The goal was to trap body heat in a small space around each child. The fur and wool created insulating layers. The children settled into position. They were used to this routine. It happened every night during winter. The familiar process was calming. With the children in place, the adults would continue their evening activities for a while longer. But the process of preparing for sleep had begun. The sleeping platforms required careful arrangement to maximize warmth. This was done each evening as part of the routine preparation for the night. The base layer was straw. This had been spread on the wooden platform surface. It provided cushioning, but more importantly created an insulating barrier between sleepers and the cold wood. On top of the straw came animal skins with the fur side up. Sheepskins were common. The dense wool provided excellent insulation. A person lying on a sheepskin would be insulated from any coldness of the platform below. More furs were layered on top. These might be additional sheepskins, or in wealthier households, furs from wild animals. Reindeer, bear, or wolf pelts all provided superior insulation. The thicker the fur, the better it trapped heat. Wool and blankets came next. These were heavy, densely woven textiles made from sheep's wool. Wool has the property of insulating even when damp, which was useful in the humid conditions of the longhouse. The arrangement created multiple insulating layers. Each layer trapped air, and trapped air is an effective insulator. The combination of materials created a warm sleeping environment. The edges of the furs and blankets could be pulled up and wrapped around sleepers. This created an envelope effect surrounding the body with insulation on all sides. In some households, Wooden panels and curtains created enclosed sleeping spaces. These box beds provided an additional layer of protection by containing the sleeper's body heat in a smaller volume. The bedding arrangement was the same night after night. Everyone knew the system and their place within it. With children settled, the adults continued their evening routine for a while longer, but eventually they too prepared for sleep. The timing varied somewhat from night to night. On some evenings, if the household was particularly tired from heavy work, adults might go to bed earlier. On others, if stories were being told or the conversation was engaging, they might stay up longer. But eventually, fatigue and the practical need for rest won out. The transition was marked by people finishing their tasks. A woman would complete the section of mending she was working on and set it aside. A man would finish sharpening a blade and return it to storage. Work materials were put away. The focus shifted from productivity to rest. The household members moved to the sleeping platforms. Each person had a customary position. This arrangement was established by family hierarchy and practical considerations. The sleeping positions weren't arbitrary. They had been worked out over time based on who needed the most warmth, who generated the most heat, and how family relationships were structured. Everyone knew their place. There was no discussion or negotiation each night. The arrangement was fixed. Elders got positions closest to the fire. The warmest spots went to those who needed them most. Older people generated less body heat and felt cold more acutely. An elderly grandmother or grandfather would sleep in the position on the platform nearest the central hearth. This might be only 6 or 8 feet from the fire, close enough to receive significant radial heat throughout the night. This proximity made a real difference in their comfort and safety. Older bodies have a slower metabolism. They produce less internal heat. They also have less insulating body fat in many cases. An elder sleeping in a cold position might not survive the night, or at least would suffer considerably. Giving them the warmest positions was both practical and a mark of respect. The household accepted this arrangement without resentment. The elders had earned these positions through age and through their contributions over a lifetime. They also held valuable knowledge. Keeping them comfortable and alive through winter was in everyone's interest. Younger adults took positions farther from the fire or at the edges of sleeping groups. They could better tolerate slightly cooler temperatures, and their body heat helped warm those sleeping next to them. A man or woman in their 20s or 30s has a more robust metabolism. Their bodies generated more heat. They could function adequately in cooler positions. They were typically placed at the ends of sleeping rows or on the platform farther from the fire. These younger adults also served as heat buffers. Positioned at the edges of the sleeping arrangement, they lost more heat to the cold air beyond the bedding, but their higher heat production made up for this loss. They essentially protected the more vulnerable sleepers in the middle positions. Parents typically slept near their children. A mother might sleep next to the younger children she had settled earlier. A father might be positioned nearby. This allowed for nighttime care if a child needed attention, if they woke frightened or needed to relieve themselves or had some other need. The entire household slept on the same 2 platforms. One ran along each side wall. People lay side by side, close together. This arrangement maximized shared body heat. The 2 platforms might hold 8 to 12 people total, depending on household size. If one platform had 5 people and the other had 4, the arrangement was still communal. Everyone was in the same room within hearing distance, sharing the same thermal environment. People lay in rows parallel to the length of the platform. Heads might all face the same direction or alternating if space was tight. Bodies were arranged efficiently to make use of available space. There was no wasted room. The closeness was total. Shoulders touched. Backs pressed against chests when people lay on their sides. Legs overlapped. The degree of physical contact was far beyond what modern people would consider normal or comfortable, but it was necessary. Physical contact was inevitable and intentional. When bodies touch, they share heat. A person lying between two others loses less heat to the environment than someone sleeping alone. The physics of heat loss explains this arrangement. The human body radiates heat in all directions. A person sleeping alone loses heat from the front, back, both sides, top and bottom. The only protection is whatever insulation they have. Bedding above and below. A person sleeping between two others still loses heat from top and bottom, but the sides are now warmed by adjacent bodies rather than losing heat. The surface area exposed to cold is reduced. The overall heat loss rate drops significantly. This principle is most protective for the most vulnerable. Children between two adults are kept very warm. Elders between two younger adults maintain better body temperature. The arrangement is strategic, not random. This communal sleeping arrangement was standard. There was no concept of separate bedrooms or private sleeping spaces. The household slept as a unit. The idea of sleeping alone would have seemed strange and impractical. Why would someone choose to be cold when they could be warm? Why would they isolate themselves when community and shared warmth were available? Privacy as a value didn't extend to sleeping arrangements. Privacy might exist for other activities. Private conversations held outside. Private moments taken alone during the day, but not for sleep. Sleep was communal by necessity and by cultural practice. Married couples slept in the household, not in separate spaces. Intimacy happened within this context, managed discreetly. The darkness, the coverings, and the unspoken understanding that everyone ignored such moments allowed for private acts within a communal space. People settled into their positions. They lay down on the prepared bedding. The furs and blankets were arranged over them. Each person adjusted the coverings to their needs. The process of lying down was careful. The bedding layers were already in place from earlier preparation. People had to position themselves without disturbing the arrangement too much. They slid under the top layers of furs and blankets, settling onto the sheepskins and lower furs beneath. Once horizontal, each person adjusted their personal covering. Someone who felt cold might pull more fur over their shoulders. Someone who felt adequately warm might leave arms outside the covering. The individual variations were minor, but important for personal comfort. The furs and blankets were heavy. The weight was noticeable and actually beneficial. The pressure helped hold in body heat. The covering pressed down on the body, eliminating air gaps where warmth could escape. Movement after settling was minimal. Shifting position required negotiating with adjacent sleepers. There was no room to move freely without disturbing others. Most people found a comfortable position and stayed in it for extended periods. The positioning of the sleeping arrangement took advantage of every source of warmth. The fire in the center provided radial heat. The animals behind the partition added warmth from one end. The shared body heat of the household created warmth within the bedding layers. The system was comprehensive. The fire had been carefully banked to provide steady heat through the night. Its radiant warmth reached the sleeping platforms, keeping the ambient air temperature above freezing. The livestock continued generating heat at the far end of the building. This warmth flowed over the partition and contributed to the overall thermal environment. The buyer end of the longhouse was typically several degrees warmer than it would have been without animals. The human bodies themselves were the final heat source. 10 people sleeping close together under insulating layers created a surprisingly warm microclimate. The bedding trapped this collective heat inside the sleeping area next to the skin. The temperature might be 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the ambient air in the hall. All these sources working together: fire, animals, human bodies, insulation from walls and bedding, created a survivable environment. Remove any one element and the system would be compromised. Together they provided adequate warmth for the household to sleep through the long, cold night. With everyone in position and the bedding arranged, the household was nearly ready for sleep. The fire would need final banking. The hall would grow quieter. But the most important step, getting everyone safely into their sleeping positions, was now complete. Once in position on the sleeping platforms, people added their final layers of warmth. This wasn't about removing clothes for bed, but about adding insulation. Most people kept on their undergarments. A linen or light wool tunic provided a base layer. This pulled moisture away from skin and provided a smooth barrier between skin and rougher outer materials. Over this, many people would pull on additional clothing items or simply use daytime clothes as extra blankets. Wool tunics and wool pants that had been worn during the day became part of the sleeping layer system. The most important addition was the cloak. This was a large rectangular piece of heavy wool that served as an outer garment during the day. At night, it became a blanket. Cloaks were substantial, thick, densely woven wool that provided significant insulation. During cold weather, this garment could make a crucial difference in maintaining body warmth. The principle was layering. Each layer of fabric trapped air. The air between layers was warmed by body heat. Multiple thin layers often worked better than one thick layer because they created more air pockets. Furs were pulled up from below and laid over from above. The sleeping person was surrounded by insulating materials. Below was sheepskin. Above were more furs and woolen blankets. The person's own clothing and cloak added layers in between. The goal was to create a cocoon of warmth. Body heat generated by metabolism would be trapped in this surrounding insulation. As long as heat production exceeded heat loss, the person would stay warm through the night. This system required no external heat source once established. The body itself was the furnace. The layers simply prevented that heat from escaping too quickly. With everyone settled on the sleeping platforms, the final and most critical fire management task took place. The fire had to be prepared for the long night ahead. Someone, usually whoever had been designated firekeeper for the night, approached the hearth. The fire was currently burning well, with visible flames and good heat output. The process of banking began with examining the current state of the fire. The keeper looked at the size and distribution of the coals, the amount of remaining fuel, and the intensity of the burn. The goal was to create a slow, steady burn that would last many hours. The fire needed to continue producing heat all night, but without using fuel too quickly or requiring frequent tending. The keeper began by allowing the current flames to burn down somewhat. No new fuel was added for a time. The fire settled into a bed of hot coals. Then carefully selected pieces of peat were placed on these coals. Peat was ideal for overnight burning. It burned slowly and produced sustained heat. The pieces were arranged to allow some air circulation, but not so much that they would burn quickly. More peat was added, creating a thick layer over the coals. The firekeeper shaped this layer carefully, creating a mound that would burn from the inside out. The top was partially covered with ash. This insulating layer slowed the burn rate even further. The ash kept heat in while limiting oxygen. The result was a fire that would glow rather than flame. It would produce steady radial heat for hours. The coals would remain hot until morning, when they could be stirred and new fuel added to create flames again. The smoke flaps were adjusted for nighttime conditions. The openings were reduced slightly to keep more heat while still allowing smoke to escape. With the fire properly banked, the heat source was secured for the night. In households that had them, box beds provided an additional layer of warmth. These were sleeping spaces enclosed by wooden panels on 3 sides and a curtain across the front. Not every longhouse had box beds. They represented additional construction effort and materials. Wealthier families or those with skilled carpenters were more likely to have them. Where they existed, box beds were built into the structure along the sleeping platform areas. The wooden panels created walls around a sleeping space large enough for 2 or 3 people. The front of the box bed had a curtain that could be closed. This was typically made of heavy wool fabric. When drawn, it sealed the sleeping space. The advantage of a box bed was the reduction in volume that needed to be heated. Instead of heating the entire longhouse, a person in a box bed only needed to warm the small enclosed space around them. Body heat accumulated in this confined space. 2 or 3 people sleeping in a box bed would quickly warm the air inside. The wooden walls and curtains prevented this warmth from escaping. As people settled for the night, those with box beds closed the curtains. The curtain was tucked around the edges to minimize drafts. The sleepers were now in their own small environment. Inside a box bed with the curtain closed, the temperature could be 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the main hall. This microclimate was maintained entirely by body heat and insulation. For those without box beds, the principle was the same, but less pronounced. The bedding layers created a similar effect, a personal envelope of retained warmth around each sleeper. With the fire banked and everyone in their sleeping positions, the longhouse entered its nighttime state. The atmosphere changed completely from the active evening hours. The light level dropped dramatically. With no flames, only the dull glow of banked coals provided illumination. This was barely enough to see shapes and outlines. Most of the hall was in darkness. The glow from the coals was red-orange, not the yellow-orange of active flames. It was dim enough that eyes had to be fully dark adapted to make use of it. Someone first entering from outside or first opening their eyes after closing them would see almost nothing. The coals themselves were visible as areas of dull red. The stones lining the hearth retained heat and were also slightly visible, darker red shapes in the blackness. The outline of the hearth could be made out by someone looking directly at it. Beyond the immediate hearth area, darkness was nearly complete. The sleeping platforms were barely visible as darker masses against the walls. Individual people weren't distinguishable, just an undifferentiated dark expanse where the household slept. The ceiling remained invisible, with no light reaching upward. The smoke-filled upper zone was completely black. The roof timbers couldn't be seen. The large volume of the space was suggested only by the way sounds echoed slightly in the darkness above. The temperature began a slow decline. With the fire at low output, less heat was being generated. The thick walls prevented rapid heat loss, but gradually the interior would cool over the course of the night. The rate of cooling depended on multiple factors. Outside temperature made a difference. The colder it was outside, the faster heat leaked through the walls despite their thickness. Wind affected the rate. Strong winds increased heat loss around the door and through small gaps. The thermal mass of the walls slowed the cooling process. The walls themselves had been warmed during the evening. Now they released that stored heat gradually, helping maintain interior temperature even as active heat production decreased. In the area immediately around the hearth, the temperature might drop only slightly, maybe from 55 degrees to 50 degrees over the course of the night. The banked coals continued to produce significant heat even without visible flames. Farther from the fire on the sleeping platforms, the temperature would drop more noticeably. It might go from 50 degrees to 45 degrees, or even lower near the walls. By morning, the sleeping areas could be in the low 40s or upper 30s, depending on conditions. Sounds changed. The crackling of active flames was gone. Occasional soft sounds came from the coals. Quiet pops as small pockets of gas escaped. Nearly inaudible shifting as fuel pieces settled slightly. The breathing of sleeping people became audible. 10 or more people breathing created a noticeable sound, a rhythmic pattern that filled the darkness. The breathing wasn't synchronized, creating a complex pattern of overlapping inhalations and exhalations. Individual breaths were mostly quiet, but the cumulative effect was significant. In the still darkness, this collective breathing was one of the few sounds. It marked the space as inhabited, as a place of life rather than emptiness. Occasionally, someone would shift positions slightly, creating a rustle of furs and blankets. Someone might cough or clear their throat. A child might murmur in sleep. These small sounds broke up the steady rhythm of breathing. From the byre came quiet sounds from the animals. Cattle occasionally shifted their weight or exhaled more heavily. A sheep might bleat softly. These sounds were muffled by the partition, but still audible in the quiet hall. The animals were mostly at rest, but not deeply asleep. Cattle and sheep sleep lightly, remaining somewhat alert to potential danger. They rested while maintaining a low level of awareness. Smoke continued to rise from the banked fire, but less visibly. The smoke in the upper part of the hall remained, creating a layer that helped trap heat below. The smoke flow was slower without active flames. The updraft was weaker, but smoke still rose from the hot coals, still accumulated in the upper zone, still found its way out through the roof vents. The vents remained partially open, allowing smoke to escape slowly. The opening was smaller than during active burning, keeping more heat. But still permitting adequate ventilation to prevent dangerous smoke accumulation. The layout of the space was barely visible. The central hearth was marked by its glow. The sleeping platforms were lines of darker shapes along the walls. Everything else was shadow. Navigation in this darkness required memory. Someone needing to move, maybe to tend the fire or address some need, would have to remember the layout and move carefully. Stumbling over storage items or into the partition was a real possibility. The cold outside pressed against the walls. The turf construction several feet thick prevented this cold from entering quickly. But overnight some cooling was inevitable. The exterior surface of the walls would be at or near outside temperature, 0 degrees or below. The interior surface was warmer, but would gradually cool as heat radiated away from it into the interior space. The walls acted as a buffer, slowing but not preventing heat loss. They bought time, the critical hours of the night when the fire was low and people were sleeping. Without these thick walls, interior temperatures would drop dangerously within an hour or two. The interior temperature would drop by several degrees during the night. In the immediate area around the banked fire, it might stay around 50 degrees. Farther from the fire on the sleeping platforms, it might drop to 40 or even upper 30s. These temperatures weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they were survivable, especially with the insulation provided by bedding and the shared body heat of people sleeping close together. At 40 degrees, properly insulated sleepers could maintain adequate body temperature. The bedding layers, straw, furs, wool blankets, and body heat trapped within created a microclimate around each sleeper that was significantly warmer than the ambient air. The hall would remain in this state until morning, dark, gradually cooling, but protected from the deadly cold outside. The transition to this nighttime state represented a shift from active living to passive survival. During evening hours, the household lived actively, eating, working, socializing. Now they simply existed, sleeping through the dangerous hours, maintaining life at its most basic level. The darkness was complete. The cold was held at bay, but pressing inward. The household slept on, trusting in their preparations, their shelter, and their communal warmth to carry them through to morning. On the sleeping platforms, the principle of shared warmth became most important. This was where the system of communal sleeping showed its effectiveness. Each human body generates heat continuously through metabolism. A resting adult produces roughly the heat output of a 75-watt light bulb. A child produces somewhat less, but still significant amounts. When sleeping alone and exposed, this heat radiates away in all directions. The person loses heat to the surrounding air and to any cooler surfaces they contact. In a cold environment, heat loss can exceed heat production, leading to hypothermia. When sleeping in contact with others, the situation changes. Heat radiated from one body warms the adjacent body. Less heat is lost to the environment because there is less exposed surface area per person. A person sleeping between two others still loses heat from top and bottom, but the sides are now warmed by adjacent bodies rather than losing heat. The surface area exposed to cold is reduced significantly. This arrangement is particularly effective for children and elders. Children have higher surface area to mass ratios and lose heat faster. Elders may generate less metabolic heat. Both groups benefit significantly from being positioned between warmer adults. A child sleeping between two parents is warmed from both sides. The child's heat loss is minimized. An elder with a slower metabolism gains a similar benefit. Their reduced heat production is supplemented by warmth from younger adults sleeping on either side. The bedding layers above trap the heat rising from the sleepers. The furs and wool created dead air spaces that prevented rapid heat escape. The more layers, the better the insulation. The result was a sleeping environment where body heat was shared, conserved, and maintained. The group stayed warmer than individuals could have managed alone. If the hall air was 40 degrees, the airspace under the bedding might be 60 or even 70 degrees, 20 to 30 degrees warmer. This difference was created entirely by trapped body heat. This physical closeness wasn't optional. It was a survival necessity. Privacy and personal space were concepts that had to be set aside in favor of thermal efficiency. The communal arrangement was accepted as normal. This was how people slept. Family meant sleeping together, sharing warmth, surviving together. The system worked night after night, winter after winter. This arrangement kept people alive. The simple physics of shared body heat, combined with good insulation from bedding, created survivable conditions where individual sleeping would have meant death. Several hours into the night, the Longhouse reached its coldest and quietest state. Everyone was asleep. The fire burned at its lowest point, mostly buried coals. The time was maybe 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. The night was half over or more. The household had been sleeping for several hours. The depth of sleep was greatest during these middle hours. The temperature had dropped to its nightly minimum. Near the center of the hall around the banked fire, it might be 45 to 50 degrees. On the sleeping platforms farther from the fire, it could be closer to 40 degrees or even upper 30s. The coldest areas were at the far ends of the hall and in corners away from the fire. These zones might drop to 35 degrees or slightly below, approaching freezing but not quite reaching it. The variation across the space was significant. A 10 or 15 degree difference existed between the warmest and coolest areas. This gradient reflected the distance from the fire and the effectiveness of wall insulation in different locations. Near the door, a known weak point in insulation, temperatures were lowest. Cold air leaking around the edges of the door created a cold zone near the entrance. No one slept in this area for exactly this reason. These temperatures were cold, but not immediately dangerous. The bedding system was designed to function in exactly these conditions. The multiple layers of fur and wool maintained adequate insulation, even as the ambient temperature dropped. The sleepers' bodies continued to generate heat. This heat accumulated under the bedding layers, creating a warmer microenvironment. Inside the sleeping areas next to skin, the temperature was much higher, near body temperature, despite the cold air in the hall. A person whose core body temperature dropped below about 95 degrees would begin experiencing hypothermia. The bedding and shared warmth kept sleepers well above this threshold. Core temperatures remained in the normal range of 97 to 99 degrees. Breathing created condensation. Warm, moist breath met cold air and formed tiny droplets. Over the course of the night, This moisture could accumulate on the coldest surfaces, the roof, the upper walls. In extreme cold, frost might form on the interior surfaces. Each exhaled breath contained water vapor. This vapor came from the lungs, where it had evaporated from the warm, moist lung tissue. When this warm, saturated air met cold surfaces, the water vapor condensed back into liquid. On the coldest nights, this condensation could be visible as frost forming on the underside of the roof. The roof being in contact with outside air was the coldest surface in the building. Water vapor rising through the smoke layer would freeze on contact with the cold roof timbers. By morning, a thin layer of frost might coat parts of the ceiling, visible when the fire was rebuilt and light returned. This frost would melt as the interior warmed during the day, dripping down occasionally. The walls being thicker and having more thermal mass were less likely to reach freezing on their interior surfaces, but they could still be cold enough to cause condensation. A sheen of moisture might form on the interior wall surface on very cold nights. This moisture accumulation was part of winter life in the Longhouse. It wasn't ideal. Excess moisture could damage stored materials and make the space feel damp, but it was unavoidable given the temperature differences and human respiration. The animals in the byre continued to provide background warmth. Their larger bodies generated more heat than humans. Even during the deep night, the cattle radiated significant thermal energy that helped keep the building above freezing. The 3 cows, even at rest, continued producing roughly 1,500 watts of heat, about 4,500 watts total, or roughly 15,000 BTUs per hour. The sheep and goats added maybe another 1,000 to 2,000 watts, or 3,000 to 6,000 BTUs per hour. This steady heat output never stopped. The warmth from the animals flowed over the partition into the main hall. While the effect was most noticeable at the byre end of the building, the heat contributed to the overall thermal environment throughout the space. Without the animals, interior temperatures would be several degrees colder. That difference, maybe 3 to 5 degrees, could be the margin between survivable and dangerous conditions. Occasionally, someone might stir, adjusting position or pulling coverings closer, but mostly the household slept on. The night was long and sleep was deep. Sleep movements were minimal. Shifting position required negotiating with adjacent sleepers. There was no room to move freely without disturbing others. Most people found a comfortable position and maintained it for extended periods. When someone did need to move, maybe an arm had fallen asleep or a hip was uncomfortable from pressure against the hard platform. The movement was careful and gradual. A slow shift of weight, a gentle adjustment of position, pulling a fur higher over the shoulder. The person might half wake during this adjustment, conscious enough to move, but not fully alert. Within moments, they would settle back into deeper sleep. Very occasionally, someone might wake more fully, maybe a need to urinate or some discomfort that required addressing. Full waking in the cold darkness was unpleasant. The contrast between the warmth under the furs and the cold air was stark. If someone did need to get up for biological needs or to check the fire, they moved as quickly as possible. The cold motivated speed. They would complete whatever task required attention and return immediately to the warmth of the bedding. Outside, the temperature might be 0, 10 below 0, or even colder. Wind might be blowing, snow might be falling. But inside the thick-walled longhouse, the household was protected. The system was working. The contrast between inside and outside was what made survival possible. Outside was lethal. Extended exposure would kill within hours. Inside was cold but survivable, uncomfortable perhaps, but not immediately dangerous. The walls, the fire, the animals, the bedding, the shared warmth. All these elements together created conditions that allowed human life to continue through the deepest, coldest part of the night. This was the most vulnerable time. The fire was at its lowest. People were unconscious and unable to respond quickly to problems. If something went wrong, if the fire went out, if the temperature dropped too far, if someone became ill, the household was at risk. But night after night, the system proved reliable. The carefully banked coals retained enough heat to prevent temperatures from dropping to dangerous levels. The thick walls slowed heat loss enough that the interior remained survivable. The bedding and shared warmth kept people adequately insulated. The deep night passed slowly, hour after hour of darkness and cold, but the household slept on, protected by generations of refined survival knowledge, waiting for the dawn that would eventually come. Throughout the night, the livestock at the far end of the Longhouse continued their contribution to the household's warmth. Their presence was constant and reliable. Cattle are large animals with high metabolic rates. A mature cow weighs around 1,000 pounds or more. To maintain body temperature and support such a large mass, the animal must generate significant metabolic heat continuously. The metabolic rate never stops. Even sleeping cattle produce heat constantly. The digestive process, which continues through the night as the animal processes hay consumed during the day, generates additional heat. A single cow produces roughly 1,500 to 2,000 watts of thermal energy, equivalent to running a space heater. This isn't an analogy or approximation, but a real measurable heat output that can be detected with instruments. With 3 cows in the byre, the heat output was substantial, maybe 4,500 to 6,000 watts total, or about 15,000 to 20,000 BTUs per hour. This was comparable to or exceeding the heat output of the banked fire during the deep night hours. The sheep and goats added their contribution. Though individually smaller, together they produced measurable heat. A sheep generates maybe 300 to 400 watts. 6 sheep meant another 1,800 to 2,400 watts, roughly 6,000 to 8,000 BTUs per hour. Several goats added more, maybe another 1,000 to 2,000 watts, or 3,000 to 6,000 BTUs per hour. The combined livestock heat output was maybe 25,000 to 30,000 BTUs per hour, more than the banked fire produced during the coldest part of the night. Even though they were behind a partition, this heat flowed into the main hall. Air circulation driven by temperature differences carried warm air from the byre over the partition into the living space. The physics of this heat transfer were straightforward. Warm air rises. The air, warmed by the animals' bodies, rose to the top of the byre space. Since the partition was only waist high, this warm air flowed over the barrier into the main hall. Once in the main hall, the warm air mixed with the cooler air, raising the average temperature. The effect was most noticeable at the byre end of the hall, but contributed to the overall thermal environment throughout the space. Without this animal contribution, the interior temperature would drop by several degrees, maybe 3 to 5 degrees on average, more at the byre end of the hall. This difference could mean the difference between survivable conditions and dangerous cold. The animals' breathing also added moisture to the air. This moisture content actually helped with comfort. Extremely dry air feels colder and is harder on respiratory systems. Each breath an animal exhaled contained water vapor. Large animals breathing steadily produced significant moisture output. Over the course of a night, the animals released substantial water vapor into the air. This moisture helped maintain humidity levels in the Longhouse. Very dry air, common in cold environments, can cause respiratory discomfort, dry skin, and increased susceptibility to illness. Moderate humidity, such as the animals provided, was healthier. The moisture also affected how cold the air felt. Dry air at 40 degrees feels colder than slightly humid air at the same temperature. The animals' contribution to humidity made the cold feel slightly less harsh. The animals themselves slept during most of the night. Cattle rest lying down, often chewing cud periodically. This is a normal part of bovine digestion. regurgitating partially digested plant matter, chewing it further, and re-swallowing it. The cud chewing process continued through the night. It was nearly automatic. The animal could be in a restful state while still processing food. The digestive activity generated additional heat beyond just basic metabolism. Sheep and goats also sleep, though they remain somewhat alert. Their sleep is lighter than human sleep. They can rouse quickly if disturbed. This alertness is a survival trait, allowing them to respond to potential predators. During the night, the animals shifted position occasionally. A cow might stand, stretch, and lie down again in a slightly different position. Sheep moved from lying to standing and back. These movements were quiet, but generated some sound. Their sleep patterns meant they continued generating heat while requiring no active care through the night. The family could sleep without needing to tend the animals. The animals' heat production was automatic and reliable. The partition between human and animal spaces prevented direct physical contact, but allowed thermal exchange. The design was intentional, close enough for heat transfer, separate enough to maintain different functional spaces. Direct contact with large animals would be problematic. Cattle can move unpredictably, potentially injuring people. Animal waste would contaminate the human sleeping area. Disease transmission would be more likely. The partition prevented these problems while preserving the thermal benefits. The partition height waist-high was optimal. Lower-end animals might push through or jump over. Higher and warm airflow would be restricted. The chosen height balanced containment with heat transfer. The visual separation also mattered psychologically. While people were accustomed to animal presence, completely sharing space would blur distinctions between human and animal domains. The partition maintained appropriate boundaries. In the morning, the animals would need attention, feeding, milking the cows, checking health. But through the night, they simply existed, living furnaces that asked nothing of the sleeping household, while providing continuous warmth. This symbiotic relationship was repeated in countless longhouses across Scandinavia. It represented elegant problem-solving, meeting multiple needs with a single solution. The animals needed shelter from the deadly cold. The humans needed extra heat. Bringing them together solved both problems. The arrangement also showed deep understanding of heat transfer, though not expressed in those terms. The Vikings recognized from experience that large animals generated substantial heat and that this heat could be captured and used. The Longhouse design, with its integrated byre and low partition, showed that this principle had been refined over generations. This integration of human and animal spaces under one roof was typical of Northern European cold climate architecture. Similar arrangements existed in other cultures facing similar challenges. The principle was universal. Make use of every available heat source. As the night progressed toward dawn, the animals continued their steady heat output. When morning came and the fire was rebuilt, the animals' contribution would become less critical. But through the coldest hours, when the fire was lowest and people were most vulnerable, the livestock provided a thermal foundation that supported survival. In the hours before dawn, the night reached its coldest point. This was typically between 4 and 6 o'clock in the morning, when the banked fire had burned. Lowest and outdoor temperatures hit their minimum. The interior temperature would be at or near its lowest. If the hall had been 45 degrees earlier, it might now be 40 or even 38 degrees in areas farthest from the fire. The bedding system had to work the hardest during these hours. The insulation provided by furs and wool was now critical. Without these layers, the sleeping household would be in danger of hypothermia. Body heat production slowed during sleep. Metabolism decreased. People generate less heat when resting than when active. This made the pre-dawn hours the most vulnerable time. The shared sleeping arrangement became most important. Now, the mutual body heat of people lying close together helped make up for decreased individual heat production and falling ambient temperature. A banked fire still contained hot coals, though covered with ash and mostly hidden. The core temperature of the fire pit remained high. These coals continued to radiate heat, though much less than earlier in the night. If someone woke during these hours, they would feel the cold immediately. Any part of the body outside the bedding coverings would chill quickly. This encouraged staying under the furs and remaining still. Usually, though, people slept through these coldest hours. The body's natural sleep cycle was deep during this period. Waking tended to happen later as dawn approached, and the household needed to return to activity. The pre-dawn cold was temporary. Within an hour or two, someone would wake and tend the fire. New fuel would be added. Flames would return. Warmth would increase. The coldest part of the night would pass. The household survival through these hours showed the effectiveness of the complete system. The thick walls prevented rapid heat loss. The banked fire maintained baseline warmth. The animals continued their heat contribution. The bedding insulated sleepers. The shared body heat made up for individual limitations. Each element alone would have been insufficient. Together, they created conditions that allowed the household to survive. Cold but alive, able to wake and continue when morning arrived. The long night was nearly over. Morning would come. The fire would be rebuilt. Another day would begin. The first person to wake had an important task. The fire needed to be rebuilt. Without this, the household wouldn't be able to function. Usually this responsibility fell to whoever had been designated the night firekeeper. This person would wake naturally or had trained themselves to wake at the appropriate time. Emerging from the bedding meant facing cold air immediately. The hall temperature was at its lowest. The person moved quickly to the hearth. The banked fire still contained embers. This was critical. If the coals had gone completely cold, rekindling would be difficult and time-consuming. But properly banked coals could survive 12 to 14 hours. The firekeeper used a stick to carefully move aside the ash covering the coals. Beneath the ash layer, the coals glowed dull red. They were still hot, capable of lighting new fuel. Small pieces of kindling were placed on these coals, dry wood, small twigs, bits of bark. The coals heated this material. The kindling began to smoke, then caught fire. The firekeeper blew gently on the growing flames. Air fed the burning. The flames grew larger. More small pieces of fuel were added. Gradually, the fire was rebuilt. From glowing coals to small flames to a growing fire. The process took several minutes, but it was reliable. The banked coals made rekindling straightforward. As the fire grew, it produced both light and heat. The light revealed the dim interior of the longhouse. The heat began to warm the air immediately around the hearth. The firekeeper added larger pieces of fuel, peat and wood. The fire strengthened, its light spread farther. Its heat became more intense. Within 15 or 20 minutes, the fire was fully re-established. It burned as it had the night before, though the household wasn't yet active. This was the transition moment from night to day. With the fire rebuilt, the longhouse began to warm. This was a gradual process, not immediate. The cold air took time to heat. Heat spread from the hearth in all directions. The air directly around the fire warmed first. Warmer air being less dense rose. This created circulation patterns in the hall. The smoke that had settled during the night began moving again. As the fire produced more heat, updrafts formed. Smoke was drawn toward the roof vents more actively. The temperature near the hearth increased noticeably within minutes. Farther from the fire, change was slower. The sleeping platform areas would take longer to warm. The thick walls played a role in this warming process. They had stayed relatively warm through the night, warmer than outside, but cooler than they had been in the evening. Now they began absorbing heat from the air, which slowed the warming. but would later help maintain the temperature. The animals in the byre stirred. Morning meant feeding time would come soon. Their movements and sounds increased as they sensed the household waking. Other people began to emerge from sleep. The growing light from the fire, the sounds of movement, and the gradual warming all signaled that night was ending. People remained under their bedding for a while. Emerging into the still cool air was uncomfortable. They waited until the fire had raised the temperature enough to make getting up tolerable. The firekeeper continued adding fuel. The fire grew larger and hotter. Its light now illuminated most of the central hall clearly. The long night was officially over. As the fire burned stronger and the hall warmed, more family members woke and began moving. This was a gradual process, not everyone rising at once. The first to emerge from the bedding were usually the adults who had specific morning tasks. Someone needed to tend the animals. Someone needed to prepare the morning meal. Work had to begin. People sat up on the sleeping platform, still wrapped in furs and blankets. They stayed covered while adjusting to being awake. The air was still cold enough that exposed skin felt uncomfortable. Children woke more slowly. They had slept deeply through the cold pre-dawn hours, insulated between adults. Now they stirred, reluctant to leave the warmth of the bedding. The morning routine involved getting dressed for the day's activities. This meant adding outer layers over the undergarments that had been worn for sleeping. Wool tunics, wool pants, and leather boots all were put on while still on the sleeping platform. Once dressed, people climbed down from the platforms and moved toward the fire. The warmth near the hearth made the transition from sleep to activity easier. The animals called for attention. Their sounds were more insistent now. Someone moved to the partition with hay. Morning feeding began. The sleeping platform areas were left as they were for now. The bedding would be rearranged later in the day. For now, the focus was on warming up and beginning daily tasks. People gathered near the fire, extending hands toward the heat. The cold of the night was still in their bodies. The fire's warmth was welcome and necessary. Gradually, the household came to full activity. The long night had passed. Another day of winter had begun. The cycle would repeat when darkness returned. The survival of this household through the winter night showed a system that functioned reliably. Multiple elements worked together to maintain survivable conditions. The longhouse structure provided the primary defense. The thick turf walls, 3 feet or more of compacted earth, created substantial insulation. This prevented the deadly outdoor cold from penetrating rapidly into the living space. The curved walls bore the weight of accumulated snow without collapsing. The snow itself added another layer of insulation on the roof, helping trap heat inside. The central hearth design was efficient. Positioned in the middle of the space, it distributed heat evenly to both sides. The radiant heat reached the sleeping platforms along both walls. The fire management system worked effectively. The banked coals survived the night, making rekindling straightforward. The slow burn of peat provided steady overnight heat without requiring constant attention. The livestock contribution was measurable. The animals' body heat raised the ambient temperature by several degrees. This extra warmth reduced the burden on the fire and made the overall temperature more survivable. The bedding arrangement was well designed. Multiple layers of fur and wool trapped body heat. The raised platforms kept sleepers out of the coldest floor-level air. The communal sleeping arrangement was thermally efficient. Shared body heat meant each person stayed warmer than they could have alone. Children and elders particularly benefited from this arrangement. The evening meal provided internal fuel. The high-calorie, high-fat food generated metabolic heat that lasted through the early night hours when it was most needed. Each element alone would have been insufficient. Together, they created a complete system. The thick walls without the fire would still be too cold. The fire without the walls would waste heat. The bedding without shared body heat would be less effective. This integrated approach was typical of Viking winter survival. Nothing was left to chance. Every aspect of shelter, heating, and sleeping arrangements had been refined over generations to create a reliable system. The household had survived another night. In the morning, they were cold but alive, able to continue their winter existence until spring. As morning arrived in the Longhouse, another winter night had passed. The family had survived the cold and darkness once again. The methods they used were practical, developed over many generations. The thick-walled longhouse, the central fire, the animal heat, the layered bedding, and the shared sleeping. All these elements worked together. No single element provided complete protection. The system required all parts to function together. This approach to winter survival was repeated in households across Scandinavia. The specific details varied. Some homes were larger, some had more livestock, some used more wood than peat, but the principles remained consistent. Insulation, controlled fire, shared warmth, and systematic routines allowed people to endure months of cold and darkness. The knowledge required to maintain these systems was passed down within families. Children learned by watching and participating. They absorbed the patterns of fire tending, bedding arrangement, and resource management. By the time they established their own households, they carried this accumulated wisdom. The archaeological evidence confirms these practices. Excavated longhouse sites show the stone-lined hearths, the thick turf walls, and the raised sleeping platforms. Preserved textile fragments reveal the heavy wool blankets and clothing. The remains tell the same story as the historical accounts. The Norse people didn't merely survive winter. They maintained their communities, their culture, and their way of life through conditions that would have been lethal without their systematic approach to shelter and warmth. As you settle towards sleep tonight, in your own warm space, you might notice the echoes of these ancient solutions. The layered blankets that trap your body heat, the enclosed space that holds warmth, the simple fact that shelter and insulation allow humans to rest comfortably even when the world outside is cold. The fire in the Viking longhouse has long since gone out, but the knowledge of how they kept that fire burning, how they arranged their homes and their lives to survive the northern winter remains. It speaks to human adaptability, to practical intelligence applied over generations, and to the power of systematic solutions to fundamental challenges. The long winter night passes, morning comes, the cycle continues. This was the rhythm of life in the north, repeated year after year, household after household for centuries of Scandinavian winter, measurable. The animal's body heat raised the ambient temperature by several degrees. This extra warmth reduced the burden on the fire and made the overall temperature more survivable. The bedding arrangement was well designed. Multiple layers of fur and wool trapped body heat. The raised platforms kept sleepers out of the coldest floor-level air. The communal sleeping arrangement was thermally efficient. Shared body heat meant each person stayed warmer than they could have alone. Children and elders particularly benefited from this arrangement. The evening meal provided internal fuel. The high-calorie, high-fat food generated metabolic heat that lasted through the early night hours when it was most needed. Each element alone would have been insufficient. Together, they created a complete system. The thick walls without the fire would still be too cold. The fire without the walls would waste heat. The bedding without shared body heat would be less effective. This integrated approach was typical of Viking winter survival. Nothing was left to chance. Every aspect of shelter, heating, and sleeping arrangements had been refined over generations to create a reliable system. The household had survived another night. In the morning, they were cold but alive, able to continue their winter existence until spring. As morning arrived in the Longhouse, another winter night had passed. The family had survived the cold and darkness once again. The methods they used were practical, developed over many generations. The thick-walled longhouse, the central fire, the animal heat, the layered bedding, and the shared sleeping. All these elements worked together. No single element provided complete protection. The system required all parts to function together. This approach to winter survival was repeated in households across Scandinavia. The specific details varied. Some homes were larger, some had more livestock, some used more wood than peat, but the principles remained consistent. Insulation, controlled fire, shared warmth, and systematic routines allowed people to endure months of cold and darkness. The knowledge required to maintain these systems was passed down within families. Children learned by watching and participating. They absorbed the patterns of fire tending, bedding arrangement, and resource management. By the time they established their own households, they carried this accumulated wisdom. The archaeological evidence confirms these practices. Excavated longhouse sites show the stone-lined hearths, the thick turf walls, and the raised sleeping platforms. Preserved textile fragments reveal the heavy wool blankets and clothing. The remains tell the same story as the historical accounts. The Norse people didn't merely survive winter. They maintained their communities, their culture, and their way of life through conditions that would have been lethal without their systematic approach to shelter and warmth. As you settle towards sleep tonight, in your own warm space, you might notice the echoes of these ancient solutions. The layered blankets that trap your body heat, the enclosed space that holds warmth. The simple fact that shelter and insulation allow humans to rest comfortably even when the world outside is cold. The fire in the Viking longhouse has long since gone out, but the knowledge of how they kept that fire burning, how they arranged their homes and their lives to survive the northern winter remains. It speaks to human adaptability, to practical intelligence applied over generations, and to the power of systematic solutions to fundamental challenges. The long winter night passes, morning comes, the cycle continues. This was the rhythm of life in the north, repeated year after year, household after household for centuries of Scandinavian winter.